Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Brock. I'll be taking you guys through the webinar this morning. We're going to be looking at PubNub Access Manager. Maybe some titles have been set up as a secure chat app, so we'll be looking at a chat app with a application API server that allows you to store profiles and do grants and such. Here I am again. Fred Brock, support engineer here at PubNub. Been around PubNub for a little while now, and live out in Vancouver, Washington. Passionate about low latency customer support and response times, and PubNub is in general. So I'm real excited to take you guys through this. This is our first Access Manager webinar, so it might be a little bit rough. Please do ask questions and give feedback. We love to hear from our customers and get an idea of what your use cases are and see how we can help you. So we're always available at support@pubnub.com. We're going to go over some house cleaning topics here. The agenda, we're going to look at how you participate in this webinar. I realize everybody's muted and I'm the only one that's talking, and we do want you to ask questions, so there's a way to do that, and I'll cover that in just a second. We'll go through the traditional what is PubNub introduction. For those of you that don't have any PubNub experience, this just gives you an overview of what PubNub is and what our service offering is and how you can use it and why you might want to use it. And then we're going to jump right into Access Manager with JavaScript. We're not going to be looking at the traditional subscribe and publish in slide form or in the agenda, but there's plenty of code backing up the class that you can look at and get an idea as to how to publish and subscribe. And I would encourage everybody to download the GitHub repo for both the chat app and the API server. They're not quite production applications, but they give you a good jumping start or running start in building a chat app. Okay. With Access Manager, we'll be looking at what is Access Manager, the various roles that come into play when you enable something like Access Manager, and then how do you initialize, grant, audit, and revoke rights as what we call a security authority with Access Manager. Going back to participation here. Participation, please do ask questions. The GoToWebinar has a questions gadget or component that is usually docked in the toolbar on the side of your screen, and you can enter in your questions in that toolbar, and we have a staff here. I'm not the only one presenting the webinar. I'm the one speaking, but we have a staff behind me that can help answer those questions and field you to the right location in PubNub so we can get you taken care of. If it's something that we can't answer in the course of the webinar, we might ask you to go ahead and send in a support ticket at support@pubnub.com, and we will get that support ticket in our queue and be able to respond to you and spend a little bit more time fleshing out the problems and solutions. Okay. All right, so here we go. What is PubNub? So PubNub is a globally distributed real-time data stream network. It means we can move data from one location to another location, from a user-based application to an IoT device, and back and forth for a data stream network. We're easy to use. We're very, very reliable and far less costly than trying to create a globally distributed data stream network. If you were going to stand up something like a global chat app that was used by millions of people, you'd have to invest in quite a bit of infrastructure to set up the infrastructure, to set up the systems required to scale that large. We've already done that for you. We're globally distributed, and we have many clients that push a lot of data through our infrastructure, and they do it very, very fast and reliably. Not only that, we give you 70 plus SDKs that you can use to build your solution. Chances are, if your device or your target platform can speak HTTP, we probably have an SDK that operates on that device or on that platform, or at least close to it, and you can communicate and use PubNub as a result. PubNub's broken down into a series of components or services. Publish and subscribe is our core. That allows you to publish data from one app and subscribe to it and receive it in another. Sometimes they're the same app. It just depends on what your use case is. Stream controller. Stream controller will allow you to aggregate data from multiple channels. A channel is a destination for a message, but it will allow you to aggregate multiple channels into one consumable stream. So if, for example, you're going to listen to all the messages being sent to customer service representatives at a company that had, say, 500 customer service reps, you can aggregate those channels together and consume all 500 channels as one stream. Presence. Once you have channels established and you have your solution up and running, you'll want to know who's listening to those channels, and presence allows you to do that. It gives you the ability to tap in, to join, leave, and timeout events on a channel so that you know who's on and who's left and what their state is. Storage and playback allows you to consume the data or store the data that's flowing across the channels in your solution for later retrieval, or sometimes to restore the environment for your solution. Moving on to mobile push gateway. If you're doing a mobile app, which most people are these days, in some way, shape, or form, the push gateway allows you to use the PubNub API, the simple PubNub API, to send push notifications through APNS, Apple Push Notification Service, GCM, and MPNS. So if you're dealing with push notifications or have a need for push notifications, you can use our gateway to forward those requests onto the right vendor. Access Manager, which we'll be looking at today. Once you have your solution established, you're going to want to lock down access to that solution, and Access Manager is what allows you to do that. And then real-time analytics. Real-time analytics provides you visibility into what your solution's doing, where your requests are originating from, how often they're coming in, what your peak times are. That gives you good visibility into your solution so that you can adjust or scale as needed. All right. Jumping right into Access Manager. So I'm hoping most of you guys have had at least some exposure to PubNub, but we're just going to jump right into Access Manager, which is a component of PubNub. And what Access Manager allows you to do is maintain fine-grained control, read-write access to your channels. And you can grant that access to a person, a device, an application, and a channel. Okay. You must enable this in order to use Access Manager. You have to enable it on your subkey. And I'm just going to hop out of the slides here and take you through that. So in the PubNub customer portal, you have your apps. Typically, you'll have a menu such as this, and you have all your applications and your various keys. For this class, I'm going to be using this app called Chatterbox, and I have a key called Chatterbox Dev. And it just gives me my publish key, my subscribe key, and my secret key. These are the values that you would typically use to initialize PubNub when you want to send or receive messages. Okay. Access Manager is a feature. As you can see here, I have a checkbox by Access Manager. If I didn't have Access Manager enabled, I'd have a button here labeled Enable that would turn that feature on for me. If I am using Access Manager and I find myself in a situation where I can't use any of my channels and nothing's working correctly because I didn't do grants correct, or I've granted the wrong way, I could come in and disable Access Manager and then re-enable it to kind of start from scratch. So just keep that in mind. As the note says here, once you enable Access Manager, you have to do a grant on the channels that you wish to subscribe to or publish to. If you don't do a grant, then you're going to get several 403s in your solution, and that's no fun. So just make sure that once you're ready to enable Access Manager, which I would suggest you do earlier than later, that you also are prepared to do the grants, and we'll be going through what grants are and how to do those. You can do a grant from the console, the PubNub debug console. Take you over there. We do have a beta version of a new console. I'm going to stick with the one I'm more familiar with right now. You can do a grant from our dev console if you click on PAM. Pam will give you a selection of fields here that you can fill out, and you can grant for a channel, an auth key, and then assign proper permissions. We'll be doing that through code today. But if you're not ready to do a grant via a security authority, meaning an app that is configured to do the grant, you can always do them through the console. Be very, very careful here. Grants have many levels, and you can click grant and grant access to all channels for everybody for all time, which would essentially kill Access Manager. You'd have to go out back and do a bunch of revokes. You want to be very, very careful with how you do your grants and when you do your grants. And then, as I said earlier, if you find yourself in a situation where you've made a mistake and you've granted access to all channels, or you've revoked all access, you can always disable Access Manager and then re-enable it. Okay, just a tip there. Okay. All right. What roles come into play when you're dealing with an Access Manager or enabling Access Manager? There are two main roles, and I've broken them down here. One is Security Authority. This is the app or part of your solution that's instantiated properly and can do grants for channels and grant access to resources. Usually one within a solution, doesn't have to be, it could be several, depending on what your use case is. And it's usually a server-sided application, as the one that I've done here is a node-based Mongo application that's hosted on Heroku and does the grants for rooms based on a user's service level. So. And then you have your authorized client. For those of you that are familiar with PubNub and built PubNub solutions in the past, authorized client is nothing more than a typical PubNub instance that you would instantiate in JavaScript or Node or whatever your platform is. The difference being with the authorized client, you're usually going to pass an auth key. You don't have to, but usually you would pass an auth key, and then that auth key will accompany all further calls made from that instance back to the PubNub infrastructure, so that we can ensure that if the auth key is not granted access to a resource that it's attempting to access, that we send back a 403, okay, or allow the request to go forward. All right. Some considerations for a security authority. Access Manager generates signatures for each request from the client. Okay, meaning the SDK will actually take the arguments that are going to go to the PubNub infrastructure, put them together, and generate a signature. And that signature is sent along with each request that you make to Access Manager. Part of that signature is a timestamp. If your timestamp is not within a proper range with the server's timestamp, then you're going to get mismatched signatures. Okay, so the takeaway from that is that when you develop an application to be a security authority, ensure that it's going to be running in an environment that is configured for NTP or to have the date and time set automatically. Okay, if you're getting mismatched signatures, and you're sure it's not your auth key and you're sure it's not your secret key, check your system time clock and ensure that your system time clock is up to date and reporting the right time. Okay. Otherwise, you'll get signature mismatch, and it's very, very common. I've seen this quite a bit with Access Manager, and I, in fact, fell victim to it myself very, very recently, where I was getting mismatched signatures, and part of the problem was the time clock. Okay. Granting access, okay? So the very first thing you're going to want to do, and for this particular webinar, we're using Node as a security authority. So the very first thing you're going to want to do is install the PubNub SDK, just as you would for doing a JavaScript application, except in this case, I'm using the Node package manager to grab the SDK from NPM and have that installed. And then I'm going to import PubNub into my solution. And I'm just going to jump over to my code here as opposed to sticking in the slides. Here we have I don't know if that tree view is actually visible on the webinar, but this is the Chatterbox API server. And there's one main file here, and then there's several other auxiliary files that make up an API system for storing profiles and creating what I call rooms that are attached to channels, have a level, and therefore can be granted and revoked access from. The index file is the main file. And as you can see here, I'm initializing PubNub. This is the way I do it. I typically just do the require and call init. You can also do a require and store a reference and then call init. It's entirely up to you. But this is my initialization. And just so you can see in my package.json, which is a node-based concept, I have PubNub listed in here as a dependency. I do have 378. I was doing some testing, but 3714 is the latest edition, so you can run with 3714 or 378 works as well. But 3714 is where you want to start, your latest and greatest version. And then once I do an init, again, this is for a security authority. Instead of just passing my publish and my subscribe key, I'm also going to pass in my secret key. Okay, this is the key point of creating, or the key requirement of having an instance of PubNub that's configured to be a security authority. If you're not a security authority, you won't be able to do a grant, and you won't be able to do a revoke. Okay, so when you instantiate PubNub, and you're going to use it as a security authority, ensure that you pass in your secret key. If you're not going to be a security authority, don't pass in the secret key. Secret key is something that you don't want to allow a lot of people to have access to because they could grant and revoke access to your channels. It's something that you want to consume from the console and then store somewhere in a safe place, and you don't want to change it, or you may want to change it on occasion. So you have your secret key. Everything else in here is just like instantiating a regular instance of PubNub. I'm passing in my subscribe key, my publish key, secret key again. I'm setting a UUID, which is how we identify the instance of PubNub on the server side. I'm setting an origin. You don't have to do this. And then I'm not using SSL because I don't have the certs that I need installed. But if you're doing anything secure, obviously you're going to want to use SSL. Okay. All right. So once you have your initialize and everything imported, the next thing you're going to want to do is start looking at grants. And just to mention while we're transitioning back over to the slides, Access Manager is free for all account types. So even if you're on a free account, you can enable Access Manager and use Access Manager. It's not an add-on. You can use it without having to purchase an add-on. Okay. So as we said, you want to do your init for security authority. Security authority is the entity that's going to do the grants. You're going to want to pass in a secret key. Okay, not any secret key, but the secret key that is associated with this publish and subscribe. This is very important. Many times I've seen Access Manager tickets come in, or folks have a hard time with Access Manager, and it's because the secret key is not correct. So you want to make sure that you're using the right secret key. If you're getting mismatched signatures or something's not working, check the key first, check your clock second. Okay, and usually it's one of those two things. Okay, the next thing it could be is your auth key, but I'll get to that in here in a little bit. Any other parameters still just fine. So if you're doing subscribes, you can subscribe and publish with the security authority. There's nothing different. The only difference is you can grant, okay, and revoke. All right. So granting access. I've said granting access quite a bit. So granting access, and I have some bullet points here. All your data in a PubNub solution flows over a channel. You want to protect those channels, and you enable PAM to do that. Granting permission means that you're allowing access for specific actions on specific channels by specific authorized clients. Okay, it's a kind of a mouthful, but it's not that difficult. You can grant read-write access to any of the combinations that are available to clients at the user level, at the application level, or at the channel level. Okay. There's one API call for grant, and there's various arguments that are passed into grant, and depending on which ones you pass, you may be doing a channel level, application level, or a user level grant. But here's a typical grant call, and I'm just going to pop back over to my code here and show you a grant call. Yep. So for this API server, what I have is I have PubNub initialized, and then I have two channels here that I immediately do a grant on, and I do this grant without passing in an auth key. I pass in a channel name, no auth key, and I pass in read write because I want everybody to be able to read and write to this particular channel. I pass in a TTL, which is a time to life or an expiration date for this particular permission. In my case, it's 1400 or 14,400. That's just 24 hours. TTL is specified in minutes. Callback is what's invoked when the grant has successfully completed. An error obviously is going to be invoked when there's an error doing the grant. Always implement your callback and always implement your error. Even if you're just going to do a log, you have to have something there so that you know when you call grant and nothing happens, you'll have some idea as to what's going on. These callbacks are extremely useful. The callbacks typically give you a payload back that tells you whether or not the call was successful and what permissions were actually granted. Okay. In this particular case, I'm doing what's called a channel level grant. So I'm saying anybody that's using my app has access to these two channels. Okay. And a key point here that I want to mention. Presence channels are typically created when you create a channel in any PubNub solution that you write. If you're using presence, when you subscribe to a channel or somebody publishes to a channel, somewhere down deep in the depths of the infrastructure, there's another channel with a -pnpres associated with it. So for web chat, there's web chat -pnpres. When you enable Access Manager, the grant for pnpres is not done. The grant for the presence channel is not done automatically for you. So if you did a grant and all I did was do this, that means if anybody logged in and tried to use presence on that channel, which you usually do in the SDKs in an automagic fashion, that you'd still be seeing 403s because you don't have access to the pnpres channel. That's why I'm doing both grants here, because I know that presence is going to be used because this is kind of my global channel. And I also want folks to have access to the webinar chat channel. Okay. So just key point there, make sure you grant access to pnpres. If you do your grants from the console, it automatically grants to the pnpres for you, which could be a little misleading because your console grant works, but your application's not. Okay, so just be aware that if you're writing security authority, you want to also grant to presence if you're using presence. Okay. All right. So just going over each one of the parameters here, read and write are pretty straightforward. Read gives you the ability to consume messages, subscribe to a channel. Write gives you the ability to publish messages. TTL is your expiration, your time to life on that. It's specified in minutes. You can specify 0, which I believe would be forever, or you can go as high up almost indefinitely. I think there's a upper limit of like 520. I'd have to check the actual limit. I'm not sure if maybe Craig knows that one, but there's a max on it as well. Okay. Then your callback and your error. Different levels of grants. Okay. Application level grant. If you want to allow everybody to have access to all channels and perform all functions, you can do an application level grant. It's the same grant call. The difference is you omit the channel and the auth key parameters. Okay. So in this particular case, I would just be saying anybody can read and write to all channels for 24 hours. Okay. Channel level grant. Channel level grant's a little bit different. This is granting access to a channel, but not to a user. So if you're saying everybody wants to get access or needs access to the webinar chat channel, which is the grant that I just showed you, I can grant access to that particular channel. And the difference between this and an application level grant is I'm constraining what permissions I'm granting by the channel that I'm passing in. Okay. And here I'm doing read write and TTL 1400 callback and error as normal. User level grant. This is the most restrictive, and we do this in the API server, and I'll take you over to that right now, in fact, so we can go through that. So there's a post endpoint, and there's a lot of code. This particular method needs to be refactored somewhat. The data model I have is not as efficient as I wanted it to be, but we have a post endpoint here that accepts a login, a username, and a password. It's what you actually supply when you go into the app, and does some logging at the top. It finally gets down and grabs an organization and then grabs a user ID and a password, and we'll get to grant access. Okay. And in grant access, I'm doing two things. I left this here as a reminder. Ensure that you have NTP, otherwise you're going to run into a few problems. I'm just using that time function here to compare my timestamp with the server's timestamp. And then I'm doing a user level grant. Okay, here I have a channel, and it's slightly different than what I've been talking about. If you look here, I have a channel and I have a comma delimited list of channels. So if you're going to grant to multiple channels, you can do that. You just need to supply a comma delimited list of channels to your grant call. Not an array, but a comma delimited list. So in my case here, I'm granting whatever this room is, and I believe it's the rooms have names. I think this is the main room, but it has an ID associated with it. I'm granting the channel and the presence channel in one call versus two. Okay, so that is possible for you to do. Keep it in mind. I'm also specifying an auth key. So my auth key that I'm using in this app is the user profile ID associated with the user that authenticated. So, and it's a long cryptic number, but I'm using that as my auth key because it's unique and it's associated with this user already. So I'm using that. Now, if you have an OAuth server or you're authenticating against Facebook or Twitter or any of those open or identity providers, you could grab an access token and use the access token. It's entirely up to you. The auth key is something that your application can arbitrarily generate and use. Okay. I'm passing in my read and write. Obviously, I'm allowing read and write to this channel. I could change that and make it read only or write only, depending on the use case that I have. I'm passing in a TTL, and then I have my error and my callback implemented. Okay. I think the key points here, though, are the auth key is your app's responsibility. You acquire that value using your existing either user profile, infrastructure, or device registry, whatever you're using to identify users. The auth key is usually something that's associated with a user. Okay. Otherwise, you can do channel level grants and application level grants. Okay. All right. All right, so just to recap on that, user level grant is the most restrictive. You pass in a channel and an auth key. That's what makes it a user level grant. You can pass a common delimited list of channels to the grant call as a way to grant access to multiple channels at one time. So if your user is going to have access to, say, 10 or 20 channels, you can pass those in as a common delimited list. Okay. All right, audit. So audit is a very simple function. It's just like grant, and there are two main functions in, or three main functions in Access Manager are grant, audit, and revoke. Audit allows you to retrieve a list of permissions granted to the entity that you pass in, and it works much like your grant call. The grant call allows you to omit the channel or the auth key. You can do the same thing with the audit. And this will give you a list of the permissions that have already been granted so that you can see things such as the TTL and so on, okay, or revoke as necessary. All right. Pretty straightforward. All right. Revoke. Revoke is just grant in reverse, and literally the implementation of revoke actually calls grant false false and provides a false for read and a false for write. But you can revoke, and again, the arguments are as flexible as the grant call. Okay, that would revoke permissions for you. All right. Authorizing the client is very, very straightforward, and I'll just pop over to code here. We're moving pretty quick. So that's the API server. Now I'll take you over. There's a client as well, and I can give you the GitHub repo for this is in the email that was sent to you. And there's a branch that's specifically called Access Manager, and I'll pop that into the chat. Okay. For the client, just I don't know if everybody's actually seen that. And I'm running this locally because the API server I didn't want to put out there just yet, but it is in GitHub. But this is the client, the Chatterbox client for JavaScript. And I'm running three browsers locally. One logged in as myself, one logged in as Craig, and one logged in as Donald Duck here. So I'm going to go Helper Tools. Clear. When you first log in or hit the first page of the app, it's a single page application. When you first hit the app, it checks local storage and sees if there has been a profile stored in local storage from a previous run. If not, it will prompt you to log in. There's no expiration on your login. Once you're logged into this, it stays. If you want to add to it, you're welcome to do so. You're prompted for a username and a password, and this would have to match username and a password that you created on the API server or a profile that you've created on the API server. Okay. And once you log in, what happened there is it hit the API server, retrieved your profile, retrieved your auth key, did the grant on the server side, and then came back to the application, subscribed to the channels that the application needs, and now you're logged in and ready to go. So let me go back over to the code here. This is simple single-page app. All the UI is in one file, index.html. You just have a couple modal dialogues. These are the dialogues that you see at the top. You can register a user or log in. Has some buttons. These buttons here at the top you can use to log in or register a user. And then if you keep scrolling down, you have the inclusion of the PubNub SDK. and then one large anonymous function that isn't that big, but it just executes whenever this page is actually loaded. And what happens here is we have some local functions that initialize PubNub, and here's my initialize PubNub call. And what happens here is I do a pubnub.init, so it's a little different than what I did on the API server side, but it's the same thing. I pass in my subscribe key, my publish key. I use my profile with my username as my UUID, so on presence, that's how I'm going to be identified. And then I pass in an auth key. Notice I don't pass in a secret key here. If you have SSL, I would definitely recommend using that. And then windowing is for performance, and then there's also a cipher key that you can use to encrypt the actual payload going across the wire. And I would highly recommend using that for security. So what happens here whenever initialize PubNub is called, which is called all the way down here, go all the way down to the bottom here. The app will check local storage and see if I've stored a profile. If I have, then it will go ahead and retrieve that profile. So it grabs a stringified instance of the profile from local storage, calls JSON parse, and then calls initialize PubNub. If not, then it will show the modal dialog for you to log in, and that's the modal dialog. It's called profile modal, and then you'll be prompted to log in. When you hit log in, it will come back through this function, and at that point, it will initialize PubNub. So once I'm initialized, from a PubNub perspective, the only thing that's different with Access Manager is you need to pass in your auth key if you're using an auth key. Other than that, I subscribe to a chat channel, which happens to be my webinar chat here. Okay. And when I do my subscribe, when I connect, I retrieve history for that channel. History is impacted by Access Manager. If you have Access Manager turned on and you try to attempt to retrieve history for a channel you don't have access to, you will be denied. But I retrieve my history for that and just populate the chat window. I do some logging for some of my lifecycle events, nothing huge or complicated there. And then I have my callback that gets invoked when my message arrives, and that adds it to the chat window for me. And then obviously I have my presence callback here as well. So again, ensure when you do your grants that you're granting to the presence channel as well. Otherwise, this will not function the way you think it should, and you'll get 403s. After I do my subscribe, I update my state for this particular channel, and that just sends out a presence state change event for everybody else, and that's how we get the roster on the side of the screen. The rest of this really is just for logging in and creating a user. Okay. And there's some code here that hits the API server, and there's several API methods available there for you. Okay. All right. So just a recap here. To initialize the client, you just want to make sure you send in your auth key. Okay. If you're not using a user level grant and you're only doing channel level grants or application level grants, then you could get away without the auth key. But you want to make sure that you initialize PubNub with your auth key. Okay. Once you enable Access Manager, if you enable it and you don't pass in the auth key and you haven't done your grants, you're going to see a lot of 403s, and you don't want to see that. All right. All the normal or all the add-on services PubNub provides, history, presence, push, channel groups, are all impacted by PAM. So you want to ensure that you're aware of that. You can't have an app that's going to listen for presence or retrieve history that hasn't been granted access to the channels that are required. All right. So going back over to the app here, the API server, and I'm just going to pop this. Let me grab this. So the API server, and I'll just show you how that works. We've got some extra time here. Is out there in Git, and I'm going to do a git remote -v. There's a PubNub repository, and I don't know if it was the one that was in the email or not, but I'm going to pop this over in the chat window. And I sent that over to you, Craig. I don't know if you mind just sending that out to everybody. It's pretty straightforward to start once you download it. The first thing you're going to want to do is, let me jump over to this guy right here. Very first thing you're going to want to do is there's a config.json file. Within the config.json file, I have my PubNub keys that I'm using, and I'm also using Facebook, but that's for a later modification. I'm also, I have a MongoDB. All the API calls are written using Mongo, so if you have a local Mongo, you can add that, or if you have one out on, say, Mongo Lab, like this one is, you can change the URL. I will be deleting these keys and that database after the webinar, so you'll have to change these in order to get things up and running. But once you change your settings for that particular environment, all you need to do is you can either run node index, and you can see my two application level grants or channel level grants that I did, and everything's up and running. Okay, and then you have the various API endpoints that you can hit. I have a Postman collection that will be in the GitHub repo, and this gives you the ability to go through each one of those REST endpoints for performing various tasks, such as creating an authenticated user or adding a profile connection, creating profiles, API keys, and so on, even testing out login, updating profiles, or finding rooms. So there's quite a few endpoints there. Not all the endpoints are in the Postman collection, but most of the important ones are there for you. Okay, and you can hit those. All right. As far as the client app is pretty easy. It's again out remote -v. And once you have that, you can either run this by just opening up the index file in a browser. It will work. I typically use the Python mini server and just pass in no argument, just start it up, and it will usually start on 8,000. You can also change the port. There's some other arguments for simple HTTP server. But once you have that started up, if you just go to localhost 8,000, you'll either be logged in if you've already logged in, or it will prompt you to log in. If you've logged in before, and you want to reset things, I use local storage in the app, so you can actually go into resources under the developer tools and just go into local storage, and you'll see the keys that are being stored. There's your profile. If you delete that, then the next time you refresh, you'll be prompted to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to delete them all, actually. You can also use localstorage.clear from the console. That's one way to do it. So now I'm being prompted to log in. Yep. And now I'm back in, so you can see everything's being reestablished. But just a small trick there, if you want to reinitialize or set things back to a baseline, you can go into local storage and purge what's there, and then you'll be prompted to log in, and you can continue on. Okay, very simple app. It just has a roster. It tells you the occupancy at the top of the roster, and then allows you to send chat messages. You can log in again. There's no constraints on some of that, or you can register and create a user. Okay, but it will definitely give you a kind of a bootstrap if you're new to PubNub, or if you're new to some of the Access Manager concepts. You can look at the way that I implemented it and send a support ticket in and let me know how much of it needs to change, or where you're having problems with it, and I'd love to help you out. And on the API side, one more thing that I want to know about. Jump over here. On the API server, under the bin directory, there's a seed data file. And these are the default organizations that are being created when you start up the API server. Default rooms, default users. So if you want to add to that or change the data around, you can do that. And then there's a script file here, load defaults, that allows you to load that data out into the database. Obviously, you're going to want to change your username and password and your database path there. Okay. All right. So for Access Manager, that's just about it. We have resources available to you. We have a knowledge base out there that's very, very useful, has a lot of how-tos and solutions for common problems. So if you get stumped, definitely check out the knowledge base. There's a developer community at pubnub.com/community where you can post questions, and we monitor that and try to get back to people as soon as possible on the community. Usually it's fairly quick. For support, you can send an email to support@pubnub.com, and Craig or myself will receive that ticket and route you to the right location if we can't help you, or we'll help you ourselves. Or you can submit a ticket through support.pubnub.com. And then obviously there's docs, demos, and SDKs out at pubnub.com developers that you can scour through. A lot of the topics that I've covered here are there in some tutorial form or another. And then obviously, there are a lot of apps that you can use as a point of origin for your own solution. There's several demos out there that you can use. Okay. Upcoming events. I do not have a list of upcoming events in slide form, so I'm going to pop over to the browser here. If you go to pubnub.com, all the next set of webinars that are coming up are listed here on pubnub.com. So if you're interested in attending the iOS or the Java webinar, please do come here and you can register for that. We also do have virtual office hours, which are listed here, where Craig and myself actually sit online live for a few hours, and we'll answer any questions that you might have. It doesn't matter what they are. They could be PubNub related or integrating with PubNub in some way. We'll try to give it our best shot and answer your questions. If we can't answer it, we can go grab somebody that can answer it. We work with several smart people, so they're more than willing to help. So I invite you guys to plug into that. We'll probably have some demos during that time, or crack open some code and walk through it with you. Okay. All right. I think we're just about done there. At the end of the course, when you get done, there is a survey that pops up. And if you do the survey, you'll be entered in a drawing for the OzoBot for an OzoBot. So please do stick around when you close the webinar out. A survey will pop up, fill out the questions on the webinar, and you'll be entered into a drawing there. Okay. Thank you very, very much for coming to the very first Access Manager webinar. I hope to see you guys at another webinar very, very soon. We can stay on and answer any questions that you may have. Let's see, looks like we have 2. We have a thanks. Is there a potential for a Python SDK webinar in September? I don't have one on the list. If that's something that you're interested in, though, we can definitely look at that. Or if you have specific questions about the Python SDK, you're more than welcome to send a ticket in to support@pubnub.com. We'd love to help out. Seth has a question. In this demo, a server was implemented in Node. I was under the impression that PubNub hosted a server that a client can access as well. No, Seth, we don't host a server that you can access. Well, PubNub is an infrastructure that you access via the SDKs. But as far as integration with profiles, like user profiles and other enterprise systems that you may have, we don't have a system like that. But it's not that difficult to integrate PubNub with those systems. And so for this demo, I did a small Node app that had some endpoints and integrated with a MongoDB, really.
Hey, Fred?
Yes.
Just want to chime in real quick and just mention that there's a reason why we don't have like a hosted server for users and so on. It's because we don't want to own your data, and so any sort of user database and profiles is yours, and all you do is grant access, and then that grant, we host the grant or the auth keys. We hold that information in our databases and check it for you. So you're in control of your own data. I just want to mention that really quick.
It's a good point. Good point. We have another one here from Garrett. It says, if you retrieve the history via playback, does it store in the cache? If the connection drops, can you still access the history and playback? Yeah, if your connection drops, when you reconnect, you can retrieve your history, and it will be there. Depending on how you have history configured, by default, I believe it stores for 30 days, or is it 1 day? Craig, do you know if it's 1 day or 30? I'm sure he does, but I believe
Sorry, Fred, what was the question? I was typing.
History, 30 days or 1 day by default?
I can't hear that. Sorry, got muted. Can you just? I can handle it. No. There was an echo. We've muted, but can you repeat one more time?
Sure. Is history 30 days or 1 day by default?
I don't recall, but if you go into your storage and playback add-on, you can just check it, and we don't charge by duration anymore. You enable storage and playback, you pay for the monthly base fee for whatever tier you're on, and then you pay for the amount of storage. So obviously the longer the duration, the more storage you'll accumulate over time, and there is unlimited as well. It's pretty minimal though.
Okay, thank you, Greg. It looks like we have Amir has a vote in for a Python SDK webinar as well. If we have enough interest, I'm not against doing one. I don't know if we'd do it in September. Kimball has one. Says, I noticed that the iOS PubNub SDK will retry subscribe if 403 receives. Can you provide any details on how that interaction is governed? So there is on the Android side, so that's a good question. It's slightly different, Kimball, for each one of the SDKs. So the question is, when you get a 403, the iOS SDK will just sit and retry the same call over and over, hoping not to get a 403. And the reason that is when you do a grant, there may be a microsecond in time there where you're waiting for access, but don't have it just yet. So it will retry that call for you. And on the Android side, you have a max retry. I believe you do have a max retry also on the iOS side that you can set, and that will determine how many times it retries a call. Other than that, you can capture the error and then squash the instance and then reinitialize. All right.
Yeah, actually, I think the 403 happens indefinitely until you unsubscribe. I have asked engineering why. It doesn't just fail once because it
Right.
doesn't need to keep trying,
Well, yeah, and
in my opinion.
yeah, it could retry if you didn't have access, but somebody was granting access at that very moment. Maybe you might want to retry. So maybe
Fair
that's,
point.
yeah. It just depends on how you want to handle it. But in either case, you're going to get an error. So when you get the error, you can trap the error and unsubscribe or cease doing that action. Uh, so Robbie says, I feel like I've seen mixed answers online to this. What is the default heartbeat time that is used to determine presence? Well, again, it could be a little different across the SDKs. I believe the default heartbeat is 5 minutes. Yeah, so.
I'm verifying in the source code, but it should be. Uh, I think it's like 5 minutes and 10 seconds,
Yeah,
but roughly 5 minutes. And
yeah.
you can set that as low as 15 seconds. You
I
can go
would,
lower, but we don't recommend.
yeah, I wouldn't even go lower than 30.
I
Heartbeats
agree.
are depending on where you're running your app. If you're running a mobile app, I would keep the heartbeat relatively high because you have a lot of latency in that environment, and you might get a lot of false negatives if you have it too low. But you don't want it so high that you don't know when somebody's offline either. So it's something you have to kind of play with. I've found in mobile apps, if you can keep that a little higher and then keep the interval a little lower. You can kind of dial in on an area where you're reasonably informed when somebody drops via presence. So Robert Lozano, is there documentation on how to hook Access Manager to LDAP? I don't know if there's documentation on how to do that, but the sample app that I have here comes real close to it. It's just instead of going to LDAP, I'm going to a Mongo. But the process would be roughly the same. I would check the demo page, and I would send in a support ticket because we could take a look for you after the webinar to see if we do have a demo of LDAP.
Yeah, the integration, there is no integration really. It's just you writing code. Like this, it's just a data store
Yeah.
where you keep your user profiles and access privileges and such. So you could store it in a file if you wanted, and our access manager wouldn't know anything about it.
All right. And then Robbie has a size, the approximate size of the heartbeat. Robbie, we have a document. Please send a support ticket in, support@pubnub.com. Just ask for the document that lays out the data consumption or data usage of a PubNub solution running continuously. I think it does give you some size as far as the approximate size of the heartbeat packet. It's not that large, but I know that's not a really great answer either. It's a tiny status message that comes back. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming to